Abu Ghraib?
And the place was just so dark, you know, and you knew the history. And I mean, like, you felt like it was a haunted place. You know, like at nighttime, there's certain hallways you wouldn't want to go down by yourself because, you know, you're, you know, afraid there might be a ghost or something, and you knew if something was there, it was, you know, really pissed off. It was just the most surreal place, you know, you can imagine. It's like a combination of Apocalypse Now meets The Shining. Except that, you know, this is real, and you're in the middle of it.
Please welcome filmmaker Rorey Kenery to the show. Rorey.
Great to have you here. This is an amazing piece of work. It really is.
How did it come about? How did you get access to these people who spoke to you, and how did this documentary come to life?
Well, I, like so many other people, saw the photographs come out in the mainstream media, and I was really struck by what I saw and horrified by it, quite frankly. And the question that kept haunting me was, who were the people who did this? Mm-hmm. What would motivate the soldiers? How could an American treat another person so inhumanely? And so when I was approaching the film, I really wanted to do it from the perspective of the soldiers who had committed these abuses.
Now, you talk in the beginning of the film about the Milgram experiments at Yale.
That's
and
right.
If you could quickly tell everyone what those were about.
Well, these were done in the early 1960s, and basically what he did was, it was in New Haven, and he brought a number of random people into the studio and asked them if they would be willing to shock somebody who they knew to be innocent. And what he found is that 100% of the participants were willing to shock somebody who they knew to be innocent just because they were told to do so by somebody in a position of authority.
And that's sort of the premise for this film.
Well, a lot of what the film, I think, shows, and a lot of what the evidence indicates, is that these orders came from above, that the soldiers were, in fact, following orders. I went into this thinking it was going to be a psychological film. What would motivate somebody to do this? And what I found over and over again when I asked the soldiers why they did what they did, is they all said the same thing: we did it because we were told to do it.
What struck me was how young most of these soldiers were. They were all so young, and in your documentary they seemed so innocent, you know, and just sort of stating the facts and saying, well, it's just that what we were told to do. Is that what you...
Absolutely. Israel Rivera, you know, when I asked him where he was on 9/11, this was one of the soldiers, he said, you know, I was in my Algebra 2 class. I mean, they're coming out of high school, going in, and, you know, they're 19, 20, 21 years old. They have very little training. They had no training to do the work that they were asked to do, to be prison guards, let alone to be involved in the interrogations. And they were following orders. Not that that excuses what they did.
Those were written orders.
Those were not found to be written orders, I heard. I mean, there were some openings in terms of what the Geneva Convention had originally stated and what was permissible. It changed a few times, it said in your documentary, what they were allowed or not allowed, permitted and not permitted to do to their prisoners, correct?
Yes,
so then they were also taking orders from the interrogators.
They were taking orders from the interrogators, but there are signed documents in the film by people like Sanchez, who was one of the leaders in Iraq, that authorized a lot of the techniques that we saw in the photographs. And that
was
was
nothing authorizing to pile them up in a pyramid in sexually suggestive positions and then photograph them.
Sexually suggestive positions was in fact authorized.
Yes,
in all cases, in all prisoners. Now, do you believe, after doing this, Rorey, do you believe that all torture or any means of extreme interrogation should be off the table?
I don't think that it's strategic to be a nation that condones torture for a whole range of reasons. You know, I think ultimately it's not very useful, it's not very strategic, it doesn't actually get information in large part. Most of the studies have indicated that. And the bigger point is that it diminishes us as a nation. These are policies that have been in this country not just going back, you know, for the last 40 or 50 years. You know, to the Geneva Conventions, but you can go all the way back to George Washington, and when he was asked how should we treat British soldiers, and at that time the British were beheading Americans, they were torturing Americans, he said treat them with dignity and respect. Treat these prisoners with dignity and respect.
Yes, even though they don't deserve it, even though these terrorists who walk around in civilian clothing and blow up hundreds of children.
Some of them. Some of them, but some of these people
do.
Yeah,
some of them were held probably without anything to be held for, and I think that is wrong.
I interviewed.
Children were in there, Elisabeth. Children were in there.
I saw the documentary. I know that children were held, but I think in the case of those held in blocks 1A and B that were, you know, I mean, high-level terrorists with information. I mean, what do you do when you have a terrorist who has a ton of information, you know, like KSM, who just confessed. What do you do with him? Do
Okay,
you not
before
use
you
extreme
answer
measures?
that, is it true that the person who was sent from Guantanamo Bay, over to Abu Ghraib, General Miller, he was brought there because Donald Rumsfeld was not happy with the amount of information he was getting as a result of the torture techniques that they were doing there. So he went from the very successful torture place in Guantanamo Bay over to Abu Ghraib. Is that true?
That's correct.
That's true.
Guantanamo Bay also, just so you know, as a whole, these were extreme methods that were horrific. But I think to paint the entire Army's way of getting information, really for our benefit to be safe, is not accurate. I think in Guantanamo Bay, they're allowed to have their prayer time 5 times a day. They're served meals.
Okay,
what do you want to do?
Elizabeth, you have to stop. You have to stop. You can ask a question, but you can't just blather on your opinion. She's here to talk about that. Ask her a question.
I asked the question, then you said before you answer it, you went in with
Because you're
something
trying
else.
to say that what happened was just based on these few bad apples, and what her whole entire film showed is that it was orchestrated by our own government and condoned by them. And you saw it twice.
I saw it twice.
Yes. So if you have a question, ask her.
I asked her the question.
What's the question?
I asked her the question.
Should we torture people? She said no.
At high levels.
And I would say, in terms of the question
get to finish
of
starting my
Guantanamo
question.
and what happened there, that what we have is actually a lot of evidence, signed documentation from the FBI, documenting extensive torture. So what we saw at Abu Ghraib was not an aberration. What we saw at Abu Ghraib was indicative of a much larger policy of torture techniques that were not only happening in that prison, but throughout Iraq,
And there was reprimand,
Afghanistan, and Guantanamo.
These people were taken out of position, correct, and reprimanded and demoted as well. I mean, this has been something that's been remedied, right? I mean,
Yeah, to date there have been 11 low-ranking soldiers who have served time, but nobody up the chain of command has faced significant penalties.
Grainer,
But
10
he
years,
was a
but he was
low-ranking
even
soldier. But no, despite an overwhelming amount of evidence that indicates that people up the chain of command not only knew what was happening, but actually authorized it, nobody up the chain of command has faced
There
significant
was a green
penalties.
light, basically a green light policy. So these guys just went ahead and did
there
it.
was an opening, and they interpreted it in a
think
way that
that's-
was not written or determined that they
That's
did.
not true, Elizabeth.
In terms of the actual specifics
That's
and what
not
they
true.
did, it's not
It's
how I
not
understood
true.
it.
Some of those were actual, according to, tell us about this, according to your documentary, there were cases of certain things, certain the torture that they were doing, that they had learned or had been taught from a Brazilian, I explain that to me.
Yeah,
the
okay,
Brazilian techniques of torture.
Yeah, I mean, one of the points that's made in the film is kind of the iconic photograph of the guy who was who's stretched out with the hood and the electrodes. That was actually a technique that was used. It was called the Vietnam. It was used in Brazil in the 1960s, very well known in the CIA. So how could a bunch of uneducated soldiers know about that technique unless they had been trained to do so?
Right, they're online talking.
Somebody taught them.
Somebody condoned it. And their specific actions there were obviously according to your documentary too, and I believe this, they obviously didn't feel that there would be serious actions taken against them. They didn't fear anyone coming down on them.
Their officers were condoning their behavior.
It was either someone condoning it or someone just not threatening them enough.
But
if they did act
I
this
would
way.
say to your point, Elizabeth, is that, you know, what we do know about torture policy is that when you say it's okay to do a little bit of torture, and one of our experts says this in the film, it spreads like wildfire.
Yes.
And so, yes, I do agree that there was some abuse that took place on the night shift. It wasn't all absolutely 100% authorized, but I would say 90% of it was authorized, right? Most of what we saw in these photographs was, in fact, authorized. And then it was taken an extra step or 2 or 3, depending on kind of where you stand. But the fact is that when we become a nation, which we are now, that says it's okay to torture, that type of abuse is going to take place.
Right.
And there's
There's
no
room for
way to control it.
interpretation.
And so that's
then
when
they'll
you
do it to
ask,
us.
when you say,
We have to take a break, though. We're going to take a break. We're going to